In this episode of Ideas, I talk with Jonah Berger about his books Contagious, Why Things Catch On, and Invisible Influence, The Hidden Forces That Shape Behavior. We also talk about social currency, triggers, emotion, and much more. But I love Jonah's perspective on marketing. That's why I wanted to bring him on the show and let you hear some of his ideas. I think you'll gain a lot of wisdom from this, and I hope you implement some of the ideas you get from our talk in your own life. All right, here we go. All right, today's guest is Jonah Berger. He is a marketing professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and today he's here to talk about his book, Contagious, Why Things Catch On. Jonah, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
And I want to start off by saying I read your book, Contagious, back in 2013 when it came out, and I loved it and wanted to reach out back then. And here we are 5 years later. So thank you for your work, but I do want to dive straight into that book because I think it will really help listeners, and I love how practical it is. And people can take these ideas from the book. That's what this show is all about, ideas and then running with those ideas. And so that being said, I want to talk about the 6 steps that you mentioned in the book. Really spoke to me. I think it will speak to listeners as well, but it causes things, these ideas cause things to be talked about, shared, and imitated. That's what this book is all about. And the first one being social currency. So if you would, go into what social currency is all about.
Sure. And I think before we even talk about social currency, I'll just take a quick step back to mention what you just talked about, which is, we see things catch on all the time. It might be a competitor's business. It might be an app. It might be a website. It might be a product, a service, even something at the grocery store. We see these things all the time, yet we don't always have a great understanding of why. Why does one thing succeed while something else fails? Why does some content go viral online? Why do some brands get more word of mouth? And really, how can we get some of that for ourselves? And, sometimes we think it's random or it's luck or it's chance, or we think we have to have a really big advertising budget. But it's none of those things. It's actually about science. It's about the science of word of mouth. We've done a whole bunch of research, and we found that $1 spent on word of mouth goes 10 times as far as $1 spent on traditional advertising. People trust word of mouth more. We trust our peers more than we trust companies and organizations. And our peers are more targeted. They help us find good potential customers or potential consumers who might like what we have to offer. And so there's really only one question, which is how do we get that word of mouth? How can we turn our existing customers into the largest and most effective sales team we've ever had? And that's the challenge the book really goes after. How can we understand the science of why people talk and share? And how can we use that to get our stuff to catch on? And as you nicely mentioned, it talks about a framework called the STEPS framework. STEPS stands for social currency, triggers, emotion, public, practical value, and stories. And each of those is a principle we've found across verticals, across B2B or B2C, from products and services and ideas, cause all sorts of things to catch on. And so if we understand these principles, we can bake them into our products and services, and we can add them in as ingredients to our marketing to be more successful. And so you mentioned social currency, for example, the first of those 6 steps. And the idea behind social currency is a very, very simple one. We're more likely to share things the better those things make us look. And I tell an example in the book to make this concrete, to help us understand it. I tell an example of a hot dog restaurant in New York City. So imagine you're in New York, you're walking around, you're hungry, you got to get a bite to eat. So you walk down a flight of stairs into this restaurant called Criff Dogs. They have dozens of different hot dogs, everything from, a hot dog, onion and pineapple to a traditional New York style water dog. But in the corner, something interesting. There's a phone booth. And if you slide open the door and you walk inside, you see a rotary dial phone. And if you stick your finger in that rotary dial phone, one of those things you have to go around in a circle, and you indeed go around in a circle, someone will actually pick up the other line. And they'll ask you whether you have a reservation. And if you do have a reservation, or a friend of yours happen to make one, the back of that phone booth will open and you'll be led into a secret bar called Please Don't Tell. And on the one hand, you might say, well, Please Don't Tell has violated all traditional laws of marketing. There's no sign on the street. There's no sign inside the restaurant. They're doing everything they can to make themselves basically impossible to find. But there's a secret about secrets, right? They made themselves a secret. And there's an interesting secret about secrets, which is if you know something that not everyone else does, if someone tells you not to tell everyone else something, what's the first thing you do with that information? Well, very simply, you tell someone, because having access to information that not everyone else knows makes you look smart and makes you look in the know. And so the simple idea is how can we make our customers, our existing customers, feel like insiders? How can we make them feel smart, feel special, feel in the know, and use that to get them to talk about us?
That's really good. And that makes a lot of sense when you say word of mouth spreads, because for runners listening, that reminds me of Brooks Running Company compared to other companies such as Nike, who spends a ton of money on marketing. They spend all of their money based on research and development. And so they make a better product, and their products spread because the product is better. So people tell other people about their products. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned running. I actually was a cross-country runner in high school, not a very good one, but I remember being introduced to Brooks. And I remember what it was is lots of people wearing Nike, and someone would say, oh, Nike's fine, right? They're a pretty good brand. But, this Brooks brand is actually an expertise in running. And I said, oh, I'd never heard of it before. But if we think about, well, why did that person tell me? They told me because they feel like they discovered it, right? Sometimes when we do so much paid media, we do so much advertising, yes, it increases awareness, but it's not very persuasive, and it ruins that sense of discovery. People don't feel like they're discovering the brand. They feel like the brand is being foisted on them. But when people discover it, when they feel like they've made it their own, like my friend who found Brooks and liked it and wanted to tell me, they feel like they're in the know. They feel like they're special. They feel like they're smart. And so one question is, sometimes it's better to restrict information a little bit. Sometimes it's better to give our existing customers something that makes them feel like they're different from everyone else, whether it's access to special information or new products or new ideas before everyone else. Make them feel like they're in network, like they're different from everybody else by working with us. And if we make them feel special, think about it, right? Status is only good if other people know that you have it. I think about frequent flyer status, for example. We all have friends who love to brag about how they're gold this or platinum that, or
Right.
The airport lounge in Rome Fiumicino no longer has the hummus that they like. What they're really saying is, look at me, I'm busy, I'm important. But no one can say that. So they have to figure out a way to brag without seeming like they're bragging. So they take pictures of their feet, for example, in first class, or they show their bag tags from whatever airline they have status on. But along the way, while they're talking about themselves, right, that airline gets to come along for the ride. They don't care about the airline. They want to show you that they're special, that they're smart, that they have status. But along the way, the airline that gave them that status is part of the conversation. And so that's the same question for our brands and our organizations. How can we make people feel special and use that to get them to talk about us?
Is social media part of this word of mouth now? Is that the electronic form of word of mouth, or is it still just in person telling one another? How does that work today?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think a really important one. We have this notion that when we say word of mouth, we mean social media. And indeed, social media is a channel through which word of mouth flows. It's certainly made it faster and easier for information to spread. It's allowed there to be a digital record of what people have shared, and it allows it to reach geographic distances that face-to-face communication would take a while to get to. But when you actually look at the data, you say, what percent of all word of mouth is online? You might be surprised. So when I ask people that question, they often say, 60%, 70%, maybe even 80%. The number's actually more like 7 to 10%. 7 to 10% of all word of mouth is online. And many of the organizations I work with go, God, such a small portion is online. Why are we investing so much money in social media? And I often say, wow, that's a really good question. Because it's not that social media is not useful, but it's not the only channel to which word of mouth flows. I think we have this sort of default tendency to say, well, if I want to get word of mouth, I need to do it online. That's actually not the right question. The question is, where do your customers learn about you? Start with them, put them in the center. Where do they learn about you, whether online or off? And how can you use that to generate more word of mouth? Right? If I'm a company that primarily sells online for goods that people need to do a lot of research on, then maybe online's the best place because that's where they collect all their information. Right? I'm working at the moment with a new mattress startup, and people look at online reviews to figure out where to buy this mattress. So maybe online's pretty useful. On the other hand, if we're talking about maybe a travel destination or a consumer product, well, then a lot of it's offline. And so it's really understanding where people are learning about us and using that as a channel to increase word of mouth.
That's really interesting. I think I remember reading that in the book, 7%, and was astounded at that statistic.
Yeah.
That's crazy. You also raised the question in the book, which I thought was interesting since we're talking about word of mouth. You ask, which product do you think gains more word of mouth, Cheerios or Walt Disney World? And, as I'm reading, before I get to the answer, I'm thinking, of course, it's Disney World, but you go on to say, no, in fact, it's Cheerios. Now, how can that be true? I found that really interesting.
and what I love about that example is it points out a hole in our knowledge. Right? Where we have this notion that if people like something, they'll definitely talk about it a lot. right? Of course, if people like something, they must talk about it. If something's interesting, they must talk about it, right? Don't people talk about interesting things more than boring ones? If you ask people, for example, which would you rather talk about, an interesting movie or a boring one, everyone will say they talk about interesting things because we want to see ourselves as interesting. But if you actually analyze the data, if you actually scratch under the surface, you see something quite surprising, which is people think that they talk about stuff they like. They think that they talk about the most interesting things, but they don't actually all the time. And the reason, very simply, is what I'll call triggers. If something is top of mind, it's much more likely to be tip of tongue. If I said peanut butter and, for example, what word might come to mind?
Jelly.
Yeah, or if I said rum and, you might think of
Coke.
Coke, right? Notice, even though those things aren't around, one thing reminds us of something else, right? When we're in a conversation, often we're trying to fill in conversational space. Someone's talking about what they're doing, and we talk about what we're doing this weekend. Is what we're doing this weekend the most exciting thing we can think of? No, right? It's often, hanging out with friends, taking the kid to soccer practice, going to see a movie. We spend a lot of time talking about what we're having for lunch, what we're doing on the weekend, and the weather. Let me tell you, the weather is not the most exciting thing out there, but what it is it's frequently triggered. We think a lot about it, so we're much more likely to talk about it. We see it a lot, so we're much more likely to talk about it. There's a great recent example. Since the book came out, you're probably familiar with Geico's ad for Hump Day. But as you know, Wednesday is called Hump Day. Monday's the beginning of the week. Friday's the end. Wednesday's the hump you have to get over to get to Friday. And the insurance company Geico builds a piece of content based on this. There's a really annoying camel walking through an office going, what day is it today? What day is it? What day is it? Everybody ignores him. He's a very annoying camel. Finally, he comes across this poor woman, and she goes, it's Hump Day. And the camel gets very excited, and the ad goes, how happy are people who save money with Geico? Happier than a camel on Hump Day. Camels humps Hump Day. And you chuckle, right, when you see it. And I chuckled when I saw it as well. But here's the weird thing. It's not that funny. I mean, it's a little funny, but it's not that funny. Yet this is the second most shared ad of a couple years ago. Not a beer ad, not a car ad, but an insurance ad, right? And I work with lots of organizations that do B2B software, for example. They say, God, this stuff is really fun. I'd love to do it. But, we're not selling Tesla cars or hidden bars. We're selling, B2B software. There's no way we can get people talking about B2B software. And I'd say the same thing about insurance, right? We don't think about insurance as the most exciting product category. Yet this ad is the second most shared ad of a couple years ago. And so one question is why? And so if you look in the data, it's pure triggers. So you see something interesting. You see a spike in shares, and then it goes down. And then you see another spike, and then it goes down, and then another spike, and then it goes down. If you look closer, those spikes aren't random. They're 7 days apart. And you look even closer, you'll notice that they're every Wednesday, whereas it's colloquially known Hump Day, right? That content is equally good or bad, depending on your preference, every day of the week. But Wednesday rolls around, provides a ready reminder, what psychologists would call a trigger, to make us think about it and talk about it and share it. Because if something's top of mind, much more likely to be tip of tongue and much more likely to be purchased. It's not just whether people like us or not, it's whether they're thinking about us or not.
That's really good. And moving on to the third principle right after this in the STEP program you mentioned is emotion. And I think we all know what emotion is, but what really had me intrigued about this is I started thinking about manipulation. And so first, is it okay to play with people's emotions as businesses as we put together these ads? Is that an okay thing to do? But then also, how does this play into the bigger picture of getting ideas to spread? And then how can we use this step of emotion to our advantage?
Yeah, a good set of questions. And so first, we have a notion that, well, do all emotions spread, right? Or do some emotions spread more than others? We've been talking about, the fact that people like status. Maybe people share things that evoke positive emotions, but they don't share things that evoke negative emotion. But when we actually look at the data, there's a lot of examples of negative things that people talk about and share. A couple months ago, for example, there was a big issue with United Airlines where they dragged someone off the plane, and lots of people were angry and anxious and upset about that. They weren't happy, they were upset, and they were sharing it. And so one question as well, is it positive, is it negative, or what is it, right? Why do emotions drive sharing? And what I like to talk about here is the idea that the more we care, the more we share. The more emotionally invested we are in something, the more likely we are to pass it on. I think too often as business owners, we think a lot about function. We say, this is how the product works, and this are its features, and this is why it's so great. We list a bunch of attributes. We spend a lot less time focusing on feelings, right? We spend too much time focusing on features, not enough time focusing on benefits. Why is someone using this? They're not using it because of the features that it offers. They're using it because of the benefits that those features provide them. And so when we start thinking about emotion, we're much more likely to get to features. We're much more likely to tap into something that people actually care about, which can drive them to share. And I think one more just extra detail is useful here is, as we mentioned, all emotions linked to sharing. And so we did a big analysis of this. We looked at 6 months of New York Times articles. So everything written by the newspaper, everything from front page news and sports and weather to basically everything else you could think of. And we looked at, what made the most emailed list and why, controlling for who wrote it and what section it appears in and where it's featured in the paper. What about certain content made people likely to share it? And we certainly found useful information was shared, interesting content was shared, but even beyond that, the emotions that content evoked affect whether people shared it or not. But we found something interesting. In general, positive emotion was more likely to be shared than negative emotion. But when we looked at negative emotions, we found that sadness decreased sharing. So the more sad content made people feel, the less likely they were to share it. But the more angry or anxious that content made people feel, the more likely people were to share it. And so what's weird is that anger and sadness are both negative emotions, right? Neither of them feels good. Whether we're angry or we're sad doesn't feel good. So why would anger increase sharing while sadness decrease sharing? And so actually, if you think about it, emotions don't only differ based on whether they're positive or negative, whether they make us feel good or bad, but also whether they evoke us to action, whether they drive us to take action. If you think about emotions like anger or anxiety, when we feel those emotions, our blood starts pumping, our heart starts quickening, we're ready to take action. It's like if you're in a cabin in the woods, for example, and you hear a scary noise, your body's on alert, right? You're ready to take action. You're ready to do something. Sadness, on the other hand, is an emotion that's more about deactivation or not doing very much. It's about powering down rather than powering up. And same thing on the positive side. Lots of positive emotions are high arousal, like inspiration or hope, surprise or excitement, even humor. But there's some that are about contentment, which are not as activating or arousing. And so what we find in our work is all these high arousal emotions, all the ones that fire us up to take action, are the ones that drive us to share. And so as marketers, too often, we're living in the kind of the bottom left. It's positive, but it's low arousal positive. People feel okay about us, but they don't want to do very much. But if they don't want to do very much, they're not going to share. And so we have to make them feel excited, surprised, delighted, all those high arousal, positive emotions that will drive them to take action. And at the same time, it's not bad to sometimes deal with negative emotions, particularly if we're solving a problem that someone is angry or they're anxious about, then touching on that problem and dealing with the emotion that's evoked by that problem can encourage people to talk and share. And I think this distinction between sort of arousal or physiological activation is an interesting one if we think about the last couple elections. Whether you like them or not, both our last couple presidents used high arousal emotion to drive voters to take action. We think about Trump, he very much harnessed negative high arousal emotions, things like anxiety and anger. Our country's going down the tubes, people are taking our jobs, all these things to motivate people to take action. All of fake news is based on anger and anxiety. So whether you like him or not, he's leveraged those emotions effectively, whether conscious or not, to get people to share. At the same time, Obama, go back an election or two ago, Obama also used high arousal emotion, but it wasn't anger or anxiety, it was hope and inspiration, right? He used hope and inspiration. That was the main message of his campaign to drive people to take action. And so when we look closer, we might think those things are very different, but they're actually very much the same. They're all high arousal emotions that drive us to take action and to share.
That's really good. And as businesses, those are some ideas to take a look at our own marketing and how it is. And we might need to change some things because I know a lot of listeners, myself included, we don't have a marketing department. It is us, not only as content creators, but we're also doing the marketing and speaking and pretty much everything. So that's really challenging there as well. Wrapping up on the book Contagious here, I want to skip to this last principle being stories. You say that we need to make our message so integral to the narrative that people can't tell the story without it. And I wanted to ask you, what did you mean by that exactly?
There's a lot of discussion in storytelling these days, using narratives to convey information to drive people to action. We shouldn't just sell, we should story tell, not just paid media, but earned media, using stories to carry our message. But what's really important about that, sometimes people forget, is a great story might be really entertaining, but if it doesn't carry the brand or the idea along for the ride, it's not going to be very successful for you, the organization. Think for a moment about The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Boy Who Cried Wolf is a great story, really engaging. But at the end of the story, you learn something. What do you learn? You learn that, lying is a bad idea. It might be a great story. It's an engaging story, but along the way, you learn a message or a moral. It comes along as part of that story. And the same thing is true with many stories. Good stories are their vessels. They're carriers of information. They bring things along with them, right? But the question is, what are they bringing along with them? Are they bringing along our brands, or are they just bringing along it's a great entertaining story? Too often, companies tell stories where consumers remember the story, but they don't remember who it's for. And that's the problem. If someone can't remember what brand it's for, they can't remember why that story is relevant to you, it's not going to help you at the end of the day. It may be viral, but it's not going to be valuable for you, the brand. So the question is, how do you build a Trojan horse story? A story that carries your message or your brand along for the ride.
Oh, that's so good. And that was your book, Contagious, one of my favorite books I've read in the past few years, but I wanted to move on to your other terrific book real quick, Invisible Influence. If you would, just give us a quick synopsis. What is the premise of that book, and why did you feel the need to write that one?
It's been a couple of years since Contagious came out. We've sold over 500,000 copies in over 30 million languages. I've had an opportunity to work with all sorts of companies, from large Fortune 500s to small startups. And along the way, I learned a lot about business, about marketing, about applying the ideas in the book. But there were also a lot of questions that came up through those engagements that book didn't solve. People would say, oh, great, I understand we can use these tools, the steps to get our products and our services to catch on. But what about if I want to motivate my employees? What if I want to be more influential at work? What if I want to be more persuasive, better at changing people's minds? What if I want to make better decisions, whether alone or in groups? And I realized there was a lot of research that spoke to those questions that wasn't in Contagious. And so that's very much what Invisible Influence is about. It's reaction to all of the things that came up since Contagious was written that aren't really addressed in that book. I think we all realize that influence is a powerful tool, but if we don't understand how to wield that tool, we're not going to be very effective. If you take a hammer, for example, and you try to use the wrong end to bang in a nail, it's not going to work very well. And so Invisible Influence is all about influence, how it works, and how we can take advantage of its power. It's often invisible how it works. And by making it visible, hopefully we can better understand how to use it in our both personal and our professional lives.
And that was another great book as well. I read that one after I read Contagious. And like you said, it's kind of a continuation, and it pertains to groups and individuals as well. I got a lot out of it. Jonah, thank you so much for giving us all those points to think about. I know I've benefited from it. I think listeners will as well. But I wanted to ask you, I try to ask every guest on the show, it could be something that you've already mentioned here today. It could be a new idea for us. But if you have one last piece of advice you'd like to leave us with today, what would that be?
I think word of mouth is a powerful tool. Many of us, particularly entrepreneurs, are already taking advantage of it. Most of your customers come in through referrals. And the question is just, how can we bottle that and make it more effective? Rather than getting lucky sometimes and unlucky others, how by understanding how it works can we take advantage of its power?
Great advice. Last question for you. Where would you like to send people to find out more about you and your work?
Oh, thank you. The books are available anywhere books are sold. You can find me at jonahberger.com, just first name, last name.com. And I'm also at J1Berger on Twitter.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on the show. I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you got something out of these ideas. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode.